네, 그럼
So let us begin the EU-Korea Business Webinar to achieve 2050 climate neutrality. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, I am your host today. My name is Kang Jun-wook from KBC-SD. Simultaneous interpretation is provided throughout today's webinar, so you will be able to see the channels at the bottom of the screen, so please refer to them if you require interpretation. In today's webinar, we will be touching on Korea's and the EU's 2050 climate neutrality strategies, and also share some insights on strategies to achieve net zero. It is jointly hosted by KBCSD, EU Korea Climate Action, and European Chamber of Commerce in Korea. Before we begin today's seminar, let us invite the Secretary General of KBCSD, Hong Hyun-jong, for his opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. I am Hong Hyun-jong from KBCSD, Korea Business Council on Sustainable Development. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Christopher Hyder, President of European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and Advisor Lee Min-ho of law firm Yulchon, and also Deputy Chief in Mission, John Bogarts of EU delegation to Korea. Thank you very much. Also, my special gratitude goes to Director Oh Il-young of Ministry of Environment, who is going to give us presentation, Attorney Adam Brown at Denton Law Firm, and also Attorney Yong-hee of Yulchon Law Firm, and also Mr. Yoo Sung-han of BASF Korea, Dr. Jae-yong of POSCO. Thank you very much. And also those of you joining us virtually, as well as on site, thank you very much for joining us today. According to Korea Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD, the average global temperature has recently recorded the highest since weather observation. Due to such climate change, more than 800 million people worldwide are currently exposed to dangers such as drought and typhoons. On top of that, many animals and plants are said to be on the verge of extinction due to changes in their habitat. Also, WBSCD is warning that the climate crisis will cost companies around the world a huge amount of extra cost amounting to $1 trillion over the next 5 years. WBCSD also warns that companies that do not take measures to respond to the climate crisis will damage their credibility and reputation in the future. And major international financial institutions such as HSBC and World Bank are already expanding ESG-linked loans. Therefore, companies' response to the climate crisis and achievements of carbon neutrality are not an option, but it is a prerequisite for survival. Therefore, many businesses are actively working toward carbon neutrality. In the midst of this, led by the EU, major countries such as United States and Japan have declared 2050 carbon neutrality, and they are moving quickly to transition to a green economy. In particular, the EU increased its GHG reduction target to be achieved by 2030 from 40% to 55%. Its increased ratio compared to 1990 and is planning to revise the European climate law in the near future. Korea also announced 2050 carbon neutrality to the global community last year. And at the climate summit held last month, President of the Republic of Korea announced that he's going to raise NDC, the nationally defined contribution target for 2030 sooner or later. Therefore, KBCSD is an organization comprised of CEOs of companies leading sustainable development, aiming at finding the direction of major climate change response policies in Korea and the EU, are sharing examples of how major companies are responding to provide practical help to companies in establishing ESG management strategy. That is the purpose of today's webinar. In the future, KBCSD will host forum for information exchange like today's to strengthen cooperation with various stakeholders and deliver the voices of industries that are striving for achieving carbon neutrality to the government and mitigating the climate crisis and moving toward the green business. All of these pending challenges, we'd like to overcome or resolve them wisely. I sincerely hope that today's webinar can serve as an important chance so that all the various stakeholders in Korea and EU can exchange their ideas and communicate closely and also share their visions so that we can achieve carbon neutrality together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your kind remarks. Next, we will hear from the President of ECCK, Christoph Heider, who will be delivering his congratulatory remarks. Sir, you're on mute, so we're unable to hear your.
It's always the same it's always the same mistake I do. I apologize. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Christoph Heider, President of the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and I'm pretty proud to co-host this event. And I would like to welcome everybody to today's meaningful event. So what I like especially is that we have speakers from Europe and Korea, from government and business, to share their visions, their views on how to achieve climate neutrality. I think we all know how challenging, how tremendous challenging, let's say, the achievement of carbon neutrality is. This is why we need not only full commitment from individuals, from corporations, from governments, but we need to have collaboration by all those stakeholders, because climate change is something which is not only affecting private people, is not only affecting companies, is not only affecting countries or governments, is affecting all of us. So this is why I'm very happy to see that we have today a good mix of stakeholders here today. So alone we cannot succeed. We can only succeed if we cooperate and collaborate, also across borders. Yesterday, there was a conference, a small conference, which is called Blue Skies and Net Zero Campaign, headed by Ban Ki-moon, and I had the honor and pleasure again to meet with Ban Ki-moon. And climate change is close to his heart. He used to use one specific statement or phrase for demonstrating how important our activities are. And the first one was so that there is no option B because there is no planet B. So this means really we have to start action. We have to focus on our initiatives to avoid, let's say, a climate catastrophe. Yesterday, he was coming up with a new statement, and this was COVID-19. COVID-19, we have a vaccine. The rollout has started, and hopefully sooner or later, the COVID-19 pandemic will be disappeared. So for climate change, we don't have a vaccine. It all depends on us. It depends on us how we structure how we change our life, how we change how to do business, how to do politics and the like. And this is, I think, why today's event is so meaningful, so important, because it provides views from different angles, from different directions, and hopefully not only the viewers or participants, but also the panelists and the speakers can take home some valuable lessons learned, some best practices. So without further ado, I would like to hand over back to the experts in the room, because I'm not an expert, I'm only a very interested person. But I hope it's time to start with contents. And I wish everybody participating not only in an informative session, but also a pleasant one. Thank you very much.
네, 총장님 말씀 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much. Next, we'd like to invite Lee Min-ho, Senior Advisor from Yulchon. He'll be giving us congratulatory remarks. Hello, everyone. I'm Senior Advisor in charge of ESG Research Institute from Yulchon. My name is Lee Min-ho. I'd like to first of all welcome speakers and also the participants joining us virtually and on site as well. I also would like to express my gratitude to DCM John Bogarts of the EU delegation to Republic of Korea and also Christopher Hyde from the ECCK. Thank you very much. And also KBCSD. Thank you. And we will be joined by Senior Associate Adam Brown from Dentons and also from Yulchon. Tony will be joining us to give a presentation, and Dr. Yoon from BASF. You heard the congratulatory remarks already. As a co-host, I'd like to say two things briefly. First, recently, there is a hot topic that is attracting a lot of attention, which is ESG. Once again, the topic that we'll be discussing today is focusing on ESG as a key element to enhance the company's competitiveness. In light of that, today's webinar is being held in a very timely manner. At the same time, this is a low carbon emission event, of course, due to COVID-19, but today's forum is held a webinar way, which means that when participants come to the on-site, that means that people move around and carbon are emitted, but we are hosting the webinar, which means that we have minimized the carbon emission. Once again, focus on carbon neutrality and ESG. We'll be hosting more meetings in the future. Yulchon promised to make contribution. That's it. That's about the welcoming remarks. Thank you.
네, 고문님 말씀
Thank you, Director, for your kind remarks. Last but not least, we have a message from the Deputy Head of the EU delegation to Korea, John Bogarts.
European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, delegation to the Republic of Czech. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to share some introductory words today on behalf of the European Union delegation to the Republic of Korea. As you know, climate change is a strategic priority of the European Union, as well as the EU delegation's work. We are therefore very happy to support this cooperation between the Korea Business Council on Sustainable Development, the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea, Yulchon LLC, as well as the EU-Korea Climate Action Project. The EU-Korea Climate Action Project was launched in 2018 to support Korea's transition towards a low-carbon economy. The project complements our government-level policy dialogues by engaging with civil society organizations, local authorities, academia, youth, and of course, business in Korea. Korea and the EU have committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Earlier this week, South Korea's local governments joined this call and pledged to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. This long-term goal helps set a clear direction of travel, predictability for business and investors. The Korean and European Green Deals, with their massive financial commitments, will help leverage investments in green and digital innovations. Ultimately, however, private sector will also play a vital role in the transformations that will turn our shared climate commitments and ambitions into a reality. The transformation to growth decoupled from resource use has and will continue to provide business with new opportunities. As you know, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Over the past 10 years, the Free Trade Agreement has played an important role in facilitating bilateral trades and investments. Trading routes increased by over 46%. At the delegation, we look forward to continue working closely with you, the business community, to create new sustainable business opportunities, both in Korea and in Europe. I wish you all a productive meeting and look forward to learn about the outcomes of today's event. 감사합니다.
네, 부대사님 말씀
Thank you very much. DCM will officially kick off today's webinar. The session will be moderated by Senior Advisor Lee Min-ho of Yulchon. Thank you. From now, we will officially begin the webinar. under the title of the 2050 Climate Neutrality. Let me introduce the order of today's webinar. We have invited 5 speakers. We have with us Mr. Adam Brown from Dentons, and also we have Director Oh Il-young from Ministry of Government, and also from companies, private company, 3 speakers. So Korean time, we plan to wrap up today's meeting by 5 p.m. So I'll be giving you 20 minutes to each speaker. Please make sure to finish your presentation in 20 minutes. After 5 speakers make presentation, we are going to open the floor for about 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A session. So let me invite the first speaker, Director Oh Il-young of the Ministry of Environment, will be talking about revised GHG emission reduction target for 2050 climate neutrality.
안녕하세요.
Ladies and gentlemen, nice to meet you. As introduced, my name is Oh Il-young. I'm the director of the Climate Change Strategy Division of the Ministry of Environment. First of all, I am very happy to take part in this seminar where we'll be discussing the importance of carbon neutrality and ESG. My presentation is centered on Korea's strategies to achieve 2050 climate neutrality and the progress that has followed since we first announced our plan. My presentation will be in this order: the announcement and progress, the trends in the private sector, the major tasks to achieve net zero, relevant laws and acts, and the efforts for social innovation. In 2010, October, President Moon announced that we will achieve net zero by 2050. And in December 2020, the relevant ministries announced a draft version of the 2050 net zero strategy that encompasses 10 major areas such as energy, industry, transportation, and building. And last year, we submitted the LEDS to the UN. So these are the 10 major tasks. It starts from energy transition, high carbon industry structure renovation, future mobility transition, land and soil low carbonization, nurturing promising industries, establishing innovation ecosystems, revitalizing circular economies, protecting the vulnerables, realizing local-oriented carbon neutrality, and raising awareness among the public. As you can see, across all industries and all segments, we have tried to reflect the main details, and we also factored in the protection of the marginalized and also the effort at the local government level. And ever since this announcement, especially this year, there are major international events such as the Leaders Summit on Climate held by the Biden administration in April 22nd, and in May 30 and 31st, we will hold the P4G summit meeting. There's going to be the G7, G20 scheduled, and in September, there is the UN summit meeting. And there is one theme that penetrates all of these international events, which is the importance of carbon and climate neutrality. So we will be having very in-depth discussions on this topic. President Moon has recently released some very important announcements, which is that by the end of this year, he will submit to the UN a revised version of Korea's NDC, and that we will discontinue public finance to the installation of new overseas coal-fired plants. And in addition to that, there are plans to expand green finances for facility investments in renewable energy at home and abroad. As I mentioned, on the 30th and the 31st, Korea will be hosting the P4G summit meeting, which is under the theme Inclusive Green Recovery Towards Carbon Neutrality. The first meeting was held in Denmark, and Korea will be holding the second summit. 60 representatives from many countries will be taking part in the conference to discuss the respective countries' commitment for carbon neutrality. And we plan to introduce the Seoul implementation plan, reflecting our commitment for the Green New Deal and carbon neutrality. I believe that today's seminar is centered on the business representatives from Korea and the EU. So I suppose I should touch on the private sector trends in Korea. If we look at how the major companies are reacting, ever since we announced the statement in October, KEPCO announced that it will stop investments in new overseas coal-fired plants, and private companies like Samsung Hanwha and KB Finance has also announced that they will no longer invest in coal power plants. POSCO and LG Chemicals also made a similar announcement and also made clear that they support climate finance. The Bank of Korea, in line with such trends, has mentioned that it will continuously expand investments in ESG participating companies, and that it recommended high carbon industries to reduce the portion of their debts. If we look at the response of the top 500 companies in Korea, 7 out of 10 CEOs are highly interested in ESG, and 45.5% have plans to install a ESG committee, which is a big change compared to the past. If we look at the government, the Ministry of SMEs are preparing an integrated response plan to increase the importance of ESG. So the industry overall is stepping up its voluntary efforts to reduce carbon emissions. So the Carbon Neutrality Industry Transition Committee was newly launched in April. And this is a joint effort by relevant stakeholders in the industry, which encompasses cement, coal, and so forth. And if we look at the table in the bottom, Korea's largest concern is that the portion of manufacturing is very high in its economic composition. So if we revise up the NDCs very dramatically, this could place a burden on the economy. So this is something that we have to discuss going forward. Moving on to the major tasks. As I mentioned earlier, we announced the net zero plan in October, and there is a draft detailed action plan that we announced following that announcement. So this outlines the efforts that Korea has to make to achieve net zero and the strategies that the government deems important. So the overall timeline is to establish a carbon neutrality scenario first, and based on that scenario, to review detailed reduction strategies. And at the end of this year, we will be revising up the 2030 NDCs. And in next year and the year after that, we will be establishing the institutional groundwork, such as laws and regulations regarding that. So everyone is very curious about what a climate neutral society looks like, since we have to achieve that in 2050. So we are trying to envision what that sort of an economy will look like. So what I'm explaining right now is a vision that we currently have, but it will greatly depend on how well we are able to pull through with our promises. And what I'm explaining could be unique to Korea because coal and LNG accounts for 66% of power generation and renewable energy 5.9%. And we have to transition this to renewable energies, hydrogen, and CCUS gas generation in order to achieve our plan. And in the industry, our industries are the heaviest emitters, including indirect emissions. This figure could jump even further. So the heavy emitters such as steel and cement is their portion is large compared to other countries. So our goal is to transition this to zero emissions processes and zero emission technologies, and also to leverage CCUS. Transportation is also very important. It takes up around 14% of Korea's emissions. We have a clear direction here, which is to transition to EVs and hydrogen cars. This is the key when it comes to the transportation sector. Moving on to buildings. Buildings emit 7% of Korea's emissions. So the goal is to expand energy self-sufficient green buildings. And regarding agriculture and livestock, we also have to introduce relevant plans. So I just wanted to roughly touch on the overall direction. And I think the overall direction is quite similar across many countries that are committed to achieving net zero. But when you look into the detailed segments very closely, you will be able to see slight differences. So at the end of the day, the detailed plans will look different for all of the countries. So as I mentioned earlier, the Korean government will try to set out detailed strategies based on that scenario. I have outlined several of them here. So R&D investment strategies, a building, carbon neutrality roadmap, transportation, EV transition, energy, carbon neutrality, and so forth. This will be factored in to the strategies that the government will be establishing towards the end of this year. I want to mention a case in point. So in April 30th, the Ministry of Technology announced a 2050 carbon neutrality technology innovation implementation plan. And the goal is to collect opinions from entrepreneurs and other relevant stakeholders in the industry to select 10 core technologies that will have a big impact on reducing carbon and enhancing the economic competitiveness. So PVs and wind power, hydrogen, bioenergy, advancing industrial processes, steel and cement, petrochemical, transportation, buildings, digitalization, and CCUS were considered the most important pillars by the Korean government, and we will be constantly updating these details. And moving on, in order to achieve and implement such changes, we have to lay the institutional groundwork by setting straight the governance and legal regulations. So the government and the National Assembly is currently reviewing the carbon neutrality law, which involves implementing climate change impact assessments for major projects and achieving just transitions and establishing a climate risk response fund. And we will be launching something called a carbon neutrality committee. It will be officially launched this weekend, I suppose. It will be comprised of 8 major segments. And I want to highlight the importance of social innovation for net zero, which has to do with ESG. We believe that these are the important pillars, just transition and let's start with the just transition. This was highlighted by the Paris Agreement also. And this is something that the EU, United States, and all countries across the world deem very important. So at the end of the day, we have to switch from coal to renewable energy and from combustion engines to EVs. And while we are achieving that transition, we have to replace the existing jobs with new ones. And in Korea, the Ministry of Labor is conducting something called a employment impact assessment. So they will be keeping an eye on the changes brought on by such economic transitions. Moving on, establishing net zero through a local government-oriented strategy. We are currently aware that many local governments have announced to participate in the net zero local government action group. And this is because they realize the importance of the role of local governments and how big an impact that they can have on the economy. So the central government and the local governments are joining forces, and the central government is encouraging local governments to set up their own plans to achieve carbon neutrality. And at the same time, we are planning to install the Just Transition Support Center and the Carbon Neutrality Support Center to support this transition. Moving on, this has to do with finance and financial systems. Korea is preparing a green taxonomy system, what we call a K taxonomy in this area. I believe that there is a similar system in the EU. And secondly, from the financial perspective, we are trying to analyze the impact in the financial area brought on by climate change. So the FSC is keeping a close eye on this. So they are trying to expand voluntary disclosures by releasing ESG information disclosure guidances. And the ESG reports are factored in when making new investments in companies or issuing loans to them. The National Pension has also announced that it will obligate it will mandatorily include a ESG report when expanding ESG, when including new investments into their portfolio. And it also mentioned that it will be expanding its ESG investments. So that brings my presentation to an end. And I try to discuss the government's overall strategy regarding its plan to achieve net zero. Thank you very much for listening.
네, 감사합니다. 오일영 과장님.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for keeping the time. You have helped us in efficient management of our webinar. Thank you once again for summarizing Korea's 2050 carbon neutrality. In the process of carbon neutrality, just transition is extremely critical. EU has also launched EU Green Deal, which focuses very much on just transitions. It seems like Korea is also preparing quite well for the implementation of Korean New Deal as well as Green Deal, as well as just transition. There are a couple of questions, but we'll be discussing that during the Q&A session. Let me invite the next speaker. Next speaker is Attorney Adam Brown, Senior Associate of Dentons. The title of his presentation is Revised European Climate Law and Carbon Adjustment Mechanism. Are you ready?
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's a great honor for me to be here today talking to you and to contribute to today's very important webinar. I'm just going to share my slides now. Bear with me a moment. Okay, I hope you can see those and I hope you can hear me. That's good, right. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the European Union's plans to legislate for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. This legislation, if it is adopted, is likely to have a very significant effect on all global businesses, particularly those with a high carbon footprint. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to generally refer to the carbon border adjustment mechanism by the acronym CBAM. I'm sure that many of you will, sorry, I'm just going to adjust the brightness of my screen because the sun has come out. I can't see what I'm doing. Just a minute. Oh, I'm very sorry about this. can't read my notes. There we are, that's better. So I'm sure that many of you will, hang on, I can't move the slide forward. I'm sure that many of you will already understand the principle of carbon border adjustments and know something about the EU's policies in this area, but I thought it would be best to start at the beginning. So I'm going to be explaining why we're talking about CBAM now in the year of COP26, the latest UN climate change conference that the UK is going to be hosting in Glasgow this November. As we all know, climate change is a global problem. Wherever in the world you are, if you emit greenhouse gases, you affect the composition of the atmosphere and have an impact on global average temperatures. Emissions anywhere are a problem everywhere. Now, ideally, all countries in the world will enter into a global legally binding agreement to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 or soon after, but we all know that's not going to happen. That's why the Paris Agreement, signed at COP21 in 2015, developed a process of countries setting and updating their so-called nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, as we were hearing about a moment ago, to reduce emissions. These NDCs tend to focus on what we call territorial emissions. So the UK might take measures that limit or increase the costs of emissions from, say, UK steelworks. As a result, some polluting UK steelworks will close, some will switch to cleaner but more expensive production methods. So geographically, there'll be fewer emissions from locations in the UK, but the UK still needs steel, so more of its demand is satisfied by steelworks in other countries with weaker emissions regulation. Economically then, emissions caused by UK consumption won't have gone down, and there's no net benefit in terms of emissions reduction at the global level, and we call this carbon leakage. This is the problem that carbon border adjustments try to solve. How do you avoid the situation where action on emissions in one country just displaces them rather than reducing them at a global level? And a CBAM is a way for a country to take unilateral action that affects the behavior industry globally. To explain how this works, let's look at the problem from a different angle. At the moment, almost all forms of economic activity produce greenhouse gas emissions, even making a wind turbine. Arguably, the best way to encourage people to adopt cleaner technologies is to make them pay an amount that represents the cost of their emissions to society and the environment. In other words, a carbon price. Most regulatory systems of carbon pricing either take the form of a tax or a permitting scheme. A tax can be levied on consumers or on producers at various points in the supply chain. Permitting schemes require emitters to surrender a number of tradable permits based on the quantity of their emissions in a given time period. And in either kind of scheme, there are then questions about how you set the price and manage economic impacts. For example, you may want to redistribute carbon price revenues to communities that lose out in the shift to clean energy, such as those in coal mining areas. As we've already seen, nobody is trying to get agreement on a single global carbon price. So we have national, or in the case of the EU, regional schemes. But these, as we've seen, often tend to move emissions around rather than reducing them overall. A carbon border adjustment, or a border carbon adjustment or tax, builds on the idea of a national carbon price. It might say, for example, today the UK has a carbon price of £45 per tonne of CO2 emitted. All UK steelworks are paying that cost on the emissions from their blast furnaces. If somebody exports steel to the UK from a country where there is no carbon price or a much lower carbon price, the UK steelmakers struggle to compete with them. So whoever imports steel into the UK from such a country should pay an adjustment which reflects the difference between the carbon price in the UK and the carbon price in the exporting country, which may be zero. This could provide a shield for the UK steelmakers if they increase their production costs by seeking to reduce their UK carbon price costs. And they might do that by investing in new technology like carbon capture and storage that we were hearing about, or using low carbon hydrogen as a fuel. It should also encourage other countries to introduce or strengthen their own carbon pricing regimes. Because if they do that, their steel will be no less competitive in the UK, and their governments, not the UK government, will get the revenues from the carbon price on the steel that their producers have made. Okay, sounds simple, maybe? Like all economic ideas, it's a bit more complicated in the real world. And the last box on this slide lists some of the legal and practical issues that we'll come back to later. So we move from carbon border adjustments in general to look at the particular context of the EU CBAM proposals. Like Korea, the EU has a Green Deal an umbrella term for all the policies and legislative proposals relating to the area of climate change. And it's the big idea of the current Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. This slide is the Commission's own summary of the policies that make up the Green Deal. And you can see in a tiny little bit in red on the left, the carbon border adjustment is part of it. But it's an important part of the EU's ambition to become the first climate neutral continent. And that starts by reducing EU greenhouse gas emissions by 55% from their 1990 level by 2030. This is much more ambitious than the existing target of a 40% reduction by, sorry, I should have put my slide on full screen a while ago. Let me do that now. 40% reduction that was put in place only a few years ago. And to achieve this, the EU's energy-intensive industries will need to decarbonize. To do that, they'll need to invest heavily in new equipment. This seems a challenge, but also as an opportunity, part of the building back better from COVID. But the EU is also keen that areas that are currently economically dependent on high carbon industry are not left behind. There must be a just transition, again, as we were hearing about earlier. There are at least 4 separate legislative initiatives here, and these are listed in the 3rd row on the slide. And we're going to focus on the 2nd and the 4th of them, the EU's carbon pricing regime and how it will be expanded through the adoption of a CBAM. So this slide sets out the basic features of the existing EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS. A carbon pricing regime that applies to 27 countries of the EU, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And it's quite similar to the Korean ETS in several ways. Operators have to surrender 1 EU allowance for each ton of CO2 equivalent they emit each year or pay a financial penalty. The total number of allowances issued each year is subject to a cap. In sectors that are considered to be at risk of carbon leakage because of the exposure to international competition, operators can receive allowances in respect of at least some of their emissions for free, but mostly they have to purchase allowances in EU-wide auctions. If they emit less CO2 than expected, they can sell their allowances. The theory is that since the number of allowances issued each year reduces and the price is set by the market, total emissions will be reduced, and it will be those who can reduce their emissions most cheaply who do so first. But by the law of supply and demand, everything depends on the level at which the cap is set. The industries covered are electricity, heat generation, oil refineries, production of iron, steel, aluminium, metals, cement, lime, glass, ceramics, pulp, paper, cardboard, acids, bulk organic chemicals. Also, commercial aviation within the EEA, nitrous oxide from production of some chemicals, and perfluorocarbons from production of aluminium. So the EU ETS has developed in phases. Phase 1 began in 2005. Phase 4 runs from 2021 to 2030, and over time, fewer free allowances have been allocated, as the picture on the right shows. The EU ETS was meant to deliver a steadily increasing carbon price, and for a long time it failed to do that because too many allowances remained in circulation after the global financial crisis of 2008 had significantly reduced EU emissions. This depressed the price of allowances for years. Recent reforms have corrected some of these problems, and in 2019, prices recovered to 2008 levels. In the last year, they've doubled, going as high as €55. And in order to achieve the EU's increased emissions reductions for 2030, they may have to double or even triple again. So further reform is likely to be needed. That's just a graph showing it in some of the developments. So we come to the CBAM itself. The idea isn't new. There were French proposals to introduce one as early as 2009, but it's really come to prominence in the last couple of years. All EU legislation begins with a proposal from the Commission, and currently we don't know exactly what they're going to propose. We expect they will issue a draft legislation in July. There may be delay, but depending on how quickly the legislation process moves, it could come into force as early as 2023. Now, I'm not going to talk to this slide in any detail. It just makes the point that once the Commission issues its proposal, it goes through what's called the EU's ordinary legislative procedure, which is quite complicated. Basically, there are parallel discussions between the EU member states and the Parliament, and in the Parliament. And ultimately, there is a three-way conversation between the Parliament, member states, and the Commission, or trilogue, and it can take a very long time. What this means, there are lots of opportunities for lobbying for interested parties, either to talk to the Commission or the member states or the representatives in the Parliament. So the Commission had a consultation on the idea of a CBAM in 2020 without advancing any specific proposals. And these are some of the results from that consultation about what form it should take, about what industries and emissions should be covered. There were, of course, quite a number of responses, particularly from Russian companies and other companies based outside the EU who currently export carbon-intensive goods into the EU, which are very negative. We don't, as I said, have the proposals yet from the Commission, but we do have the report and resolution of the European Parliament, which was produced in March this year, which is a kind of set of instructions to the Commission about what the Parliament thinks the proposal should look like. The Parliament thinks that a CBAM is justified broadly for the kinds of reasons we've already talked about. In particular, concerned that the EU's increased climate emissions and high EU ETS prices could lead to carbon leakage. But at the same time, they stress that it could serve climate objectives and not be a protectionist measure. It shouldn't result in lack of focus on other policies that could encourage the development of low carbon supply chains. In terms of an EU CBAM, the Parliament envisaged a separate pool of EU allowances and pricing that reflects the EU ETS carbon price. What importers pay should reflect the carbon content of imported products. The resolution appears to indicate there should be a default emissions value associated with a given quantity of each product. Importers should reduce the amounts they pay either by reference to the carbon price paid in the country of production or by showing that their product was produced with lower emissions than that default value. The Parliament recommend that a CBAM should cover the same goods as the EU ETS, starting with electricity, cement, steel, aluminium refineries, glass, chemicals, and fertilizers, covering together about 94% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. But they also envisage going further, as you can see from the last bullet on this slide. The European Parliament is well aware that proposals will always be controversial from an international trade law perspective. It points out it would be desirable to have global action on carbon pricing, or at least a specific WTO or other international agreement on what a unilateral CBAM should look like. In the absence of that kind of agreement, the Parliament notes the importance of an EU CBAM pursuing exclusively environmental aims if it's going to comply with WTO GATT rules. Those who argue against a CBAM on GATT-based grounds allege the EU as a WTO member would be infringing, for example, its bound tariffs under the GATT Article 2, the most favoured nation principle in Article 1, the national treatment rule in Article 3, and so on. Now, there are good counter-arguments to all those charges, or ways to design a CBAM to avoid a successful WTO claim, but they're not straightforward. The design of a CBAM will also have to take account of other international trade agreements, including bilateral ones that the EU is party to. The impact of CBAM on developing countries could in some cases be argued to be in breach of even of international human rights conventions, unless it's implemented in a way that takes account of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in mitigating the threat of climate change. Potentially very serious, substantial revenues that could arise from a CBAM, which would belong to the Commission rather than member states. So the Parliament proposes allocating some of these so-called own resources to increasing climate finance for at least developed countries and small island states. So the Parliament so far has had the easy job of telling the Commission what results a CBAM should achieve, what broad principles its operation should be based on. The task of working out how all this is to be done in practice falls to the Commission in the first instance, as it framed its proposal, and will then be open to member states, the members of the Parliament, and everybody else to contribute their ideas as the proposal goes through the legislative process that I outlined a moment ago. There are a lot of difficult issues. Is it fair for the importer of a product to have to pay a CBAM on it if EU producers of that product are entitled to free allowances under the EU ETS? How do you compare the EU ETS price with a carbon price in a jurisdiction that has a different way of doing its carbon pricing? If you allow importers to pay zero or reduced CBAM on the grounds that their goods are produced with no carbon emissions or fewer emissions than producers from another country, how do you ensure there is adequate traceability and verification of the supply chain in these cases? A second category of issues, as with all regulation, is avoiding unintended consequences. And some of those are highlighted, that could arise, are highlighted on this slide. So my conclusions would be this. There was a recent report by a German think tank examining Asian views of an EU CBAM, which concluded as follows in relation to comments from South Korean stakeholders. They said, there is unlikely to be heavy resistance in South Korea to the EU CBAM, and the government is poised to act when details are announced. South Korea's ETS has an international component, but it may be complicated to directly link the EU ETS to avoid charges within the EU CBAM. There are no major efforts that need to be taken to make South Korea more accepting of the mechanism. The EU has led the world in developing an ETS. It wants to have the first CBAM too. Carbon pricing regimes covering a wide range of producers and products are genuinely hard to get right. It's hard to identify fair outcomes that have the necessary political support, and it's hard to craft systems that deliver those outcomes, particularly through market mechanisms. It's taken the EU 15 years to get the ETS working well. It would be astonishing if there is nothing wrong with the Commission's first proposals for CBAM, and it would be surprising if it emerges in perfect shape at the end of the legislative process. But constructive feedback from South Korea and other major EU trading partners will be essential to producing a good legislative result. I know you'll be paying close attention to the Commission's proposals when they emerge, and if there's anything we can do to assist you to analyse or comment on them, please get in touch. Thank you.
네, 브라운 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown, for your presentation.
역시 시간을 잘 지켜주시면서
And thank you for being on time. You're very precise. And he delivered many insights on the CBAM and the trends in the EU and also the concerns that arise from the system. I believe that this is something that Korea has to be interested in also as a major trade partner to the EU. I believe we will have further opportunity to look into this idea during the Q&A session. So with that, let us move on to the next presentation.
네, 탄소 중립 시대 기업의 ESG
So the third presentation is about the business ESG management strategies toward climate neutrality. Partner at Yulchon, Mr. Yong-hee, will deliver. The three presenters from now on will have 15 minutes each.
네, 반갑습니다. 법무법인 율촌.
So nice to meet you. My name is Yong-hee from the ESG Institute at Yulchon. Thank you so much for the invitation and allow me to begin my presentation. So my presentation was just cut short by 5 minutes, so I'll try to be as quick as possible.
목차는 다음과 같고요.
This is the table of contents.
먼저 ESG 에코시스템이라고
First of all, I wrote ESG ecosystem on this slide, so I think I should talk about the current environment that the ESG environment that the Korean companies are facing right now. So I'll just skip the concept part. Similar concepts are used, such as ESG regulation, ESG investment, and ESG management, but I believe that we have to draw a line between these terminologies. So E and S and G regulation is a term coined from the perspective of the government. And ESG investment has to do with the relationship between the investor and the company. So the investors have to factor in ESG elements as well when making their investment decisions. And for companies, ESG management will be the most important. So this encompasses ESG regulation and ESG investment. And this is reflecting ESG elements into their overall management strategies. So this could feel quite ambiguous. So we put a lot of thought into how to explain this in the most user-friendly way. And we decided to focus on the key ideas. So ESG has to do with how the investor can select companies that can generate a stable profit. So this has to do with investment risks. There are non-financial elements that are not quite entirely translated into figures. And the key here is to verify, disclose, and explain the relevant details based on data and statistics. So we thought that against this backdrop, ESG management is, so to speak, a data-based management strategy. So this, in other words, mean that each of the elements E and S and G were evaluated based on intuition or gut feelings in the past, but from now on, the investors are requiring that you no longer judge based on intuition, but translate these concepts into data and statistics so that it could be objectively verified. This is the key of the ESG ecosystem and the challenges that the companies are facing currently. So this is how the ESG concept has evolved over time. I'm sure you would have seen this table many times, so I'll just skip that part and focus on the top row. ESG discussions have been ongoing for a long time. It's been about 15 to 16 years. The ESG dialogue started from why the companies exist, what the purpose of companies is. In the past, enterprises' objectives were maximizing shareholders' interests. But these companies found out after that, oftentimes this leads to many backlashes and uncomfortable sentiments among the public. So the focus shifted to stakeholder-oriented principles. So focusing on ESG not only maximizes shareholder returns, but also maximizes shareholder interests. And a company has to reflect all of this into their principles. And as far as I recall, in 2019, there was a roundtable in the United States, and the CEOs were at the table, and they announced that we will be shifting from shareholder-centric to stakeholder-centric strategies. And one thing that's garnering traction here is, of course, ESG and ESG-centered management. So in Europe and in the United States, this dialogue has been continuing for 15 to 16 years. But unfortunately, in Korea, we have not had the opportunity to have such in-depth discussions. And some have a very mistaken perception that ESG management is something like a fad that will soon pass. However, I believe that we have to pay close attention to what's happening in Europe, because European companies are focusing on not only governance, but also environment and society. But in Korea, well, we are not yet sure whether if we can apply the same logic to the Korean environment, because in Korea, it is quite difficult to establish a clear governance based on the BOD, and there are few companies who have experience in carrying out stakeholder-centered governance. So maybe, well, some argue that we have to achieve an advancement of governance first before we introduce more enhanced ESG strategies. So I think we have to learn from overseas cases a lot. And as I said, what has taken a very long time in Europe, it has been achieved over a very short span of time in Korea. So I want to be optimistic still. So I wrote, who is the key player in the ESG playground here? So let's look at the roles and responsibilities of each and every stakeholder in the ESG environment. There are Korean companies at the bottom left, and their goal is to achieve ESG-based management. And on the right-hand side, there are investors like BlackRock and other asset managers. So the investors also have to be very careful, because they have entrusted assets from their clients, and they have their fiduciary duty and their responsibilities as a trustee. And at the middle, you can see ESG evaluators and voting right advisors. They are responsible of making sure that ESG management is being implemented seamlessly. And at the left-hand side, top left-hand side, there are government players. So this has to do with the fact that the government has been imposing regulations for E, S, and G even before ESG management surfaced based on the respective applicable laws. So these regulations have been existing for a long time, but the intensity of the regulation and the frequency is becoming tightened. And next up, from the perspective of a company, they have the obligation to make disclosures. And on the top right-hand side, there are stakeholders like consumers, consumer organizations, employees, workers, partner companies, clients, global clients, especially the clients in the EU. So against this overall flow, I'm not going to touch on this today, but there are many lawsuits being conducted regarding ESG. In that case, the plaintiffs are mostly investors, and sometimes the plaintiff is consumers. Sometimes it becomes the government. And in this situation, Korean companies are trying to reinforce their commitment to ESG management, and they have a lot of questions as to how they can do that exactly. So they come to Yulchon for consulting, and such consultation takes about 4 to 5 months. So I'm just going to talk about the essence today. At the end of the day, in order to introduce ESG management, you have to assess we tell them that they have to assess the risks that they're facing very objectively, and they have to be aware of the disclosure standards and also evaluation standards and figure out what is in their advantage and what is against their advantage, what is possible and impossible on their end. And another important factor is which disclosure standards or evaluation standards their major investors deem important. So after the consultation phase, we provide them with around 3 types of outputs, like the ESG management system, ESG disclosure system, and how to communicate with the stakeholders. And the third one is the action group who will be executing efforts to achieve such goals. So I mentioned earlier that ESG management at the end of the day is data-based management. So if we can implement these changes, the companies would be able to deliver a clear voice, a clear message to the external stakeholders based on objective data. And in that case, you can avoid ESG-related risks, such as unfaithful disclosures and false advertising. So I just want you to know that whenever you discuss ESG-related issues going forward, please try to envision this picture in your mind. And on the next slide, there are, as a matter of fact, a lot of evaluation criteria and standards by different evaluators. So this is a source of concern for some people. Some people might feel that it's very unfair. Some are voicing arguments that there has to be a coherent, integrated criteria. But in my personal opinion, I don't think this is a matter of right and wrong. The fact of the matter is that the priorities are different and the focus, well, the values that each institution is focusing are different. So you can just select the criteria that fit your need. So this is up to the autonomy of the industry, and I'm not sure whether if it's even possible to create one single integrated standard. And when we ask whether if ESG will help companies to enhance their corporate value, most of the companies answer yes, because they've already seen this through the news. And if you look at the literature overseas and Korea, some say yes, Some say no, some say they're not sure. So I just want to mention that this is still an unclear area. So in the 4 minutes that I have left, I am going to talk about the regulations in Korea and overseas. So the basic idea is ESG responsible investments and how to make ESG disclosures and how which factors are included in ESG management. So I've tried to summarize Korean regulations and foreign regulations. For more details, you can just read through the slides. And I'm just going to focus on disclosure, which is the main area of interest for companies. The KRX published a guideline, which is called the ESG Information Disclosure Guidance in January. This is very important, so I recommend that you take a look at it. And there are a couple guidances that it has highlighted, such as GRI, IR Framework, TCFD, and SASB. So you can craft your own strategies based on these 4 guidances. And I also want you to know that there are discussions ongoing or regarding these guidelines pioneered by IFRS and other discussions led by disclosure institutions like GRI and SASB. So I suggest that you keep a close eye on which guidance the focus is shifting to. And I think it would be a timely opportunity to focus on the EU's disclosure policies, since it is a front runner in introducing the mandatory disclosure system. What's most important is this law called the Initiative on Sustainable Corporate Government. It's been submitted to the parliament and it's being reviewed. This is very influential and has a big impact on the Korean economy as well. The key is that the EU companies thus far have only been doing due diligence into their own business processes. But when this act is passed, they will have to look into not only their processes, but all of the nodes across their supply chains, their value chains. So in other words, it means that in Korea, we mostly have voluntary disclosure policies for E and S. So they have no penalties even if they choose not to disclose the details, because they can't, they're not obligated to. But when they make wrong disclosures, they have to face a penalty or put out a defense. But in order to export products to EU partners, if that EU company is subject to the Initiative on Sustainable Corporate Governance, the Korean companies may also be requested to submit literature or disclose information, because that could be disclosed to the European market if necessary. So if you're interested in this area, I highly recommend that you keep a close eye on the progress here. Yulchon is also following up on the progress and monitoring any changes to update our clients as soon as possible. I suggest that you just briefly skim through the rest of the slides. It's roughly about the disclosure-related timeline released by the FSC, the G report, and the ES reports. The timeline could be pushed up. This is just a projection, but it could be pushed up. And last but not least, I just want to touch on the amended Environment, Technology, and Industry Support Act. So just in case some of you are not aware of the details, many companies in Korea are obligated to disclose environment-related information, but the applicable act has been amended recently, and the government has decided to subject a lot of the companies to this act. I saw in a recent interview of the Minister of Environment that starting from next year, Kospi listed companies with an asset of 2 trillion or more would be compliance entities. And in 2025, those with 500 billion won of assets would become compliance entities. So this shows that mandatory disclosure is becoming more and more a reality for Korean companies, and that the Ministry of Environment is pioneering this effort. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
네, 감사합니다. 윤영희 변호사님.
Thank you.
And yes, carbon neutrality and ESG policies are inseparable. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of that correlation.
기업의 사례를
From now, we'll hear the company case. First of all, we'd like to invite BASF Korea to be followed by POSCO. We have with us Mr. Yoon from BASF Korea. Are you ready? Hello, everyone. I was just introduced by the moderator. My name is Yoon. I'm from BASF Korea. I'm in charge of Energy Storage Asia sales team. The title of my presentation is Chemistry, Dreaming of a Sustainable Future. Well, I'd like to share with you the company's goal, which is we create chemistry for a sustainable future. Globally, we have a lot of challenges, for example, COVID-19, and also the population explodes. There is a heavy population density on urban cities, and more people would like to have their own personal individualized mobility. And all of these are not based on electricity, but rather it's based on ICE, which means that there will be more pollution and getting worse and worse. And people desire to have his or her own car, which means that our only one Earth will face with the grave serious issues. In light of that, we need to provide more food and also provide scientific solutions, which means that the role of chemistry is extremely important. In light of that, I'd like to tell you once again that BASF, the company's goal is creating a sustainable future utilizing chemistry. In relations with the sustainability, in 1994, we have already made a pledge to the global community that we will ensure long-term business success across all parts of the value chain in business. In terms of developing product and also technology, we always focus on the human being as well as environment. But what is sustainability? Sustainability means creating value for a company, for human being, for the community. And at the same time, we provide product, solution, and technology. And once again, sustainability can be a key for all of these. So sustainability not only stands for producing product, but also in all life cycle, sustainability can play a pivotal role. For example, getting raw materials in a sustainable manner, in a responsible manner, we can provide that. At the same time, we can give a positive impact to the environment and to the human being as well as to the environment. And also within the given resources, using the material, we need to use it in a more efficient way so that we can give sustainable products and solutions. And on a long-term basis, these are the goal of BASF. Now going into the ambitious goal of BASF is that we would like to achieve net zero by 2050. So carbon emission will be zero by 2050. And as a midterm goal by 2030, we'd like to achieve an absolute carbon dioxide emission of 25% by 2030. 25%. And that's over the period of 2018. And you know, the company that is involved in chemistry area, they make a lot of carbon footprint, which means that such an ambitious goal is very challenging. We not only reduce the carbon emission, but also it can also halt our profit creation and also our production facilities located in China or in other area, because more production site means making more CO2 emissions and carbon footprint. Considering all of that, we are aiming at achieving our goal, which is very ambitious, even sacrificing our profit, but we'd like to achieve the growth at the same time on a midterm basis, achieving on carbon dioxide emission reductions by 25% by 2030, and by 2050, zero carbon emission. And this is actually like, in other words, we aim to reduce global CO2 emission by 60% by 2030 compared to 1990. BASF is aiming at achieving carbon neutralization by 2050. And we are aiming at providing customers with a portfolio of low carbon products as a top priority for customer decarbonization. And also, we'd like to reduce absolute CO2 emissions by 25% globally by 2030 compared to 2018. To achieve that, we are very active in R&D activities. Let me re-emphasize BASF carbon neutrality goal. So once again, we are aiming at reducing CO2 emissions by 25% globally by 2030 compared to 2018, and also reducing global CO2 emissions by 60% by 2030 compared to 1990. And minus 55% is the EU standard. So our goal is much, much ambitious, much more. And also 2050, we plan to achieve net zero. In order to achieve all of these goals, we are making huge investment to the R&D. About 40% of our R&D activities are focusing on coming up with optimizing our process so that we can reduce carbon emission. So greenhouse gas emission reduction from BASF value chain is our critical area that we focus on. From 2018, if you look at the CO2 emissions that we produce, as of the 2020, about 2,100 ton of the CO2 is being created, and supplier or like a transporting or consumers using that or disposal, all of that is about 21 million ton of the CO2 is likely to be created. Therefore, considering all of that, we've done a research. We have submitted our report. For example, in case of the transportation within BASF, we'll be using that. We will deliver to customers, and we will be using digital tool, and we are checking how much CO2 is being emitted. We are tracking that as well. Now, let me talk to you about carbon management. Carbon management is critical, especially in relations with the climate change. Carbon emission needs to be controlled. For that, carbon management is our top priority. One of the focus that we are putting on is coming up with innovative tools so that we can manage carbon. BASF is a chemistry company, and as a company as a whole, we produce diverse kind of products. But if you look at the whole EU area, there are 10 base chemicals. Among those 10 base chemical, the CO2 emission, if you look at that, out of the total carbon emission, it accounts for 70%. So 10 chemical product in EU account for 70% of the globally produced carbon emissions. So strategically, we need to reduce carbon emissions. And how do we do that? We focus on this 70%. So most of the work that we focus on for carbon management, I'll give you examples. First, when we create or produce hydrogen, hydrogen is used in many ways. we use productions of the hydrogen with zero CO2 emissions using methane. And generally speaking, when we manufacture hydrogen, we use natural gas is being reformed, and then we create hydrogen. And then as a byproduct, we get CO2. And then we call that as a gray hydrogen. And what we are doing is we actually dilute methane, and then instead of emitting CO2, solid carbon is being produced, and we dispose that without emitting any CO2. Another sector we are focusing on is we are a chemistry company, which means that we have a lot of different kinds of the furnace, and this is called as a steam cracker. And at a high temperature, we create a chemical reactions, and then we separate these chemical elements, and it requires really high level of the temperature. We need to burn these elements, and then using the heat, we can create a chemical reaction. And we are using electricity for that, but we plan to use renewable energy, which means that we can definitely reduce carbon emission. Another thing is that in the chemical reaction, as a way of doing that, we use, once again, from the steam cracker, as a byproduct, CO2 is emitted, but we use dry reforming for syngas product using methane and CO2, and we produce olefin. So these are the examples that we focus on. And once again, the first is using methane pyrolysis, and second, using renewable energy for the furnace. Now, about the electrification, we would like to use existing disassembly furnace. As you can see here, at about 850 degrees, we operate furnace, and then we burn natural gas, and then using the heat. Once again, we emit carbon emissions, but if we use renewable energy or electricity, like for example, if the renewable energy comes from the photovoltaic or solar panels or wind turbine, definitely, then we can reduce the carbon emissions. And also we can use the low olefin aromatics. And together with the SABIC, and our company BASF, and there's one more company, three companies are doing a joint research. And if everything goes smoothly, in 5 years, we can definitely produce at the industrial scale. Another area that I like to focus on is we call this as a methane pyrolysis. And we are reducing carbon footprint through continuous process of optimization. And we produce hydrogen, and without emitting any carbon. We can use methane, and this is used a lot for the chemical company, but not only for that, but also for the electricity vehicle, etc. What about Korea BASF? It's a green hydrogen, which means that using renewable energy, we produce green hydrogen. This is called P2G project. And here we can use this as an energy buffer between the wind turbine and electrolyzer. In Jeju Island, if you go there, we have this P2G projects. In case of the wind turbine, we are connecting that with a P2G system. All of this electricity is operated by sodium sulfur battery that we have produced as a mega scale, and we use that, and energy is provided in a very stable manner. I mean, wind turbine, if you operate that, there are surplus of the electricity, we can use this so that we can produce hydrogen, and sodium sulfur battery is used here. So we can stabilize the process, but at the same time, from the sources of the energy provisions, we can replace the current existing system with that of the renewable energy. By doing that, we can reduce the carbon footprint. And we are emitting much less carbon emissions, but our long-term goal is once again the carbon that is emitted by burning the fossil fuel. We can replace that by using renewable energy such as solar panel or wind turbine. And if we optimize the process gradually, if we can replace fossil fuel with renewable energy, then we can produce low emission technology. Out of the total process, about 19 BASF operation, partially or as a whole, this CO2 emission has been reduced dramatically, or we have almost completed zero emission. So the remaining issue is the price. Of course, we need to iron that out, but the availability of the renewable energy is likely to be increased because it can contribute to the carbon reduction. This is the key to success, we believe. So briefly, I've been touching upon the goal of a BASF net zero of carbon emissions, and also BASF activities were shared. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yu Seung-hwan from BASF Korea. Thank you for sharing with us the way to reduce GHG emissions and accelerate decarbonizations and very impressive technology that BASF is doing. One of the most impressive things was that the supply chain and also disposable of all the waste. You even have a data that details how much CO2 is being emitted. I'll be asking more concrete questions during the Q&A time.
포스코
Next, we will be hearing from Mr. Jae-yong from POSCO, who will be introducing the case of a Korean company. Nice to meet you. As introduced, my name is Jae-yong. I'm an economist at the POSCO Carbon Neutral Environment Group. I am very grateful for this opportunity to speak at a meaningful seminar. My presentation is titled POSCO Pledges Carbon Neutrality by 2050. So to explain the backdrop, you may well know that the UN IPCC special report has been released in 2015, and the goal was to limit the average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. All of the governments across the world agreed with that cause, and Korea also announced to go net zero by 2050. And as you well know, global investors are imposing the TCFD guideline to companies, and POSCO's major clients like automobile companies, IT device companies, energy companies have announced that they will go net zero, and they have also proposed to form a joint partnership with POSCO. And last year, December, POSCO resolved a 2050 carbon neutrality plan at the BOD and officially announced its efforts to achieve that goal. So the objective is to fulfill POSCO's responsibility as a global citizen and also to sharpen its competitive edge by transitioning to a low carbon production system. Over the years, POSCO has been making a lot of efforts to fight climate change. In 2002, we established an enterprise-level climate change strategy. Since 2006, we have been operating a POSCO carbon management system. And in 2010, we became the first company in Korea that announced a voluntary 2020 greenhouse gas emissions reductions goal. And we did achieve that target earlier than expected. And in 2010, we released a POSCO carbon report as the first company in Korea. And we've always been participating in the government's greenhouse gas and energy target management system. And as you know, we have recently announced our dedication to net zero by 2050. Over the years, POSCO has been making constant efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, and we have been developing new technologies. Ever since its inception, POSCO has been using 11% of its total investment expenses to environment investment. And over the past 10 years, we have been investing around 938 billion won in recovering energy and improving efficiency of the processes. And we are engaging in major R&D efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the mid to long term. Here are the details. We are leveraging smart technologies to optimize the coke oven and the CDQ operation. What you see on the right-hand side is a picture of a CDQ, a coke dry quenching facility. You need a coke raw in order to generate steel, but we do not dispose of the heat that is generated. We recover all of that heat and use it to generate electricity. In this case, we can reduce around 1.4 million tons of CO2 every year. In all of the coke ovens that POSCO currently owns, we have installed the CDQs, and we have plans to install additional ones in the years to come. So here is our vision for net zero 2050. We believe that the key technology to achieve our goal is HYREX, or hydrogen reduction process. In our journey to achieve climate neutrality, we will be reducing carbon emissions by 20% by 2030 and 50% by 2040. And we will be achieving both the reduction at our business sites and social reductions, which we call avoided emissions. We will be pursuing the two types of emissions in parallel. The business reductions has to do with applying these different technologies. And by 2050, our goal is to commercialize HYREX, which is the hydrogen reduction process developed by POSCO. And avoided emissions, simply put, is to create low carbon products and to supply that across the society. And by doing so, we'll be able to utilize a different array of byproducts as a resource through which we will be able to reduce the reduction at a social level. And we will continue to maintain our market competitiveness and also contribute to the sustainable development of the economy. So I'll just briefly explain the technology HYREX. This is an innovative process. FINEX is an innovative process that POSCO has developed in-house. And based on FINEX, we will be achieving a hydrogen reduction process over the long term, which is called HYREX. We believe this is a key technology that will allow us to go net zero. So if you see the table here, the two key elements of HYREX is renewable energy and green hydrogen. So the green box there shows that in order to generate green hydrogen, you have to use renewable electricity. You have to electrolyze the renewable electricity, and then you inject that to the four-phased hydrogen reduction furnace. And then you have hot DRI, which is short for direct reduced iron. So this iron is already very much reduced, but it's still in a solid state. In that case, you have to melt that in an electric arc furnace, an EAF. This furnace is also operated based on 100% renewable energy. When this process is completed, you will emit no carbon across the process. So we will be pilot testing HYREX by 2030 and commercialize it by 2050. It seems like our 2050 goals are quite far-fetched, but so I would just like to explain a short-term goal, which is our plans by 2030. We will be achieving 20% reduction by 2030, a 10% of business reduction and 10% of social reduction respectively. And based on the country's national energy mix and the progress made in hydrogen reduction, we will be rolling following up our detailed plan every 10 years. And we will also communicate this to the stakeholders. If you see the graph here, in order to reduce 20% by 2030, you have to achieve 10% of business reduction and 10% of social reduction or avoided emissions. In our efforts for business reduction, we will improve the energy efficiency and expand the use of scrap. I'm going to get to this later on, but it's very technical. So just to explain it simply, we will be reducing the amount of coal used in our blast furnaces. And all of the byproduct gases that are generated in the process, we'll try to use this gas to generate electricity. And 90% of electricity used by POSCO will be generated from such byproduct gases. So we're trying to improve our electricity power generation efficiency. This is currently 36%. Our goal is to push this up to more than 40%. We are constantly recycling the various byproduct gases. We are using 99% of the byproduct gases to generate electricity. So we're only emitting 1%, but our goal is to reduce this even further to 1.1%. And the social reductions, what we call avoided emissions, may seem a little unfamiliar. So just to explain it in more friendlier terms, it's about creating more low carbon products and supply this to the society, such as the high tension steel plate. So in an example, in the past, we used to supply a 1-ton steel plate to Hyundai Motors. Our goal is to maintain the tension, the level of tension, but reduce the weight to 0.7 tons. In that case, POSCO and Hyundai will be generating the same level of emissions while creating that steel plate, but the consumers will be able to use that plate for a longer lifespan, and they will be emitting less carbon across the lifespan of the plate. And I believe that we can contribute a lot to the society by reducing social emissions in the transportation sector. So this is what we call avoided emissions.
그래서 저희는 이런 2050년
So 2050 is our goal, and also 2030, we also have a goal to reduce CO2 emission, and consistently in a various way, we are communicating that with our stakeholder. First of all, to our clients, POSCO is continuously providing customer required carbon information and LCA-based eco-friendly product certification information. Especially, POSCO is faithfully responding to this request. Most representative case is from the Ministry of Environment regarding 13 steel products that are most representative one. We have received certifications. This certificate commensurate with the ISO, and also this can be recognized in the global market. And also at the bottom, you can see that there are many clients of our company that joined our A100, which means that they are supplying the REC product mid to long-term basis. We are also reviewing the expansions of the renewable energy utilization. Next, I'd like to tell you about what we are doing in relations with the investors in supply chain. Investors are asking POSCO to come up with a roadmap implementing 1.5-degree linked business reorganizations, and on a long-term basis, how we are reorganizing our business structure. They are asking that. As a response, POSCO has had a IR conference call, and also we are issuing report. We are telling our investors that we are on the right track to reduce CO2 emissions. We are also communicating to them that we are on the right track. We are also reviewing our carbon fuel and also our investment, and plan to establish low carbon supply chain with global raw material suppliers. As you're well aware of, TCF, the global investor groups such as TCFD, are asking companies to check risk in connection with 1.5-degree scenario and seeking new business opportunity. As you can see from this table, POSCO has three key business. First, steel; second, battery; and third, hydrogen LNG. By 2050, we are checking our risk, and of course there are opportunity, and POSCO is analyzing the risk and opportunity in order to realize 2050 carbon neutrality. At the bottom, you can see that we are commercializing hydrogen-based carbon neutrality technology, etc. And also in the process of reducing carbon emissions, we will continuously make efforts to develop our technology. So this is my last slide. Frankly speaking, in setting out our goal to reduce GHG emission, I always show this slide, and I made a lot of efforts to represent our key ideas here. As you know, the core components of GHG reduction is how we can innovate the steel industry. And POSCO is very much focused on technology development to reduce CO2. And also we are cooperating with the stakeholders, including the government. As you know, for companies, we need to develop innovative technology and commercialize them. The government role is to provide infrastructure as well as to provide support to make everything possible. In order to actively participate in the achievement of the customer's carbon neutral goal, it is necessary to jointly develop carbon materials and to preemptively decide on the purchase contract. In order to reduce carbon emissions for some time, yes, there could be cases the raw material price can go up, but for the product, then we need to sign the contract, purchase contract, and the responsibility or the burden of the raw material price increase, we need to share the burden together with our clients. In case of the investors need to incorporate excellent sustainable ideas that can meet the conditions of the long-term investment target. And also, if the ideas are great, then investors need to come up with the portfolio to include these companies that are making a sustainable efforts. Last but not least, I might be repeating this idea, but let me re-emphasize. We look forward to realize POSCO's 2050 carbon neutrality together with the government, clients, and investors. We are going to work hard. First, it's necessary to establish a national infrastructure for the stable supply of the green hydrogen and renewable power. That's to be played by the government. And also, it is necessary to expand industrial support for the development of innovative technologies such as hydrogen reduction, steel, and also conversions of low carbon process. For the clients, product development and productions in connections with the carbon materials need to be expanded, and priority repurchase policies for carbon materials need to be adopted. Last but not least, for the investor, it's necessary to include the companies that disclose carbon reduction, carbon information in the long-term investment portfolio. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 우리 하재용 박사님.
Thank you, Mr. Ho, for your presentation. POSCO is one of the heaviest emitters in Korea, as you well know, but we believe it's very encouraging that POSCO is trying to blaze the trail in reducing its emissions, and he did a very good job in explaining the details. Personally, I think I was very much impressed by his description of the avoided emissions. If we have the time during Q&A, I think I may ask a question regarding that. So we have had 5 very amazing presentations, and we're quite on time, so allow us to move on to the Q&A session. But just one heads up. Since this is not an offline meeting, we are not able to receive questions in real time, so we did collect them in advance. and we have selected the most frequently asked questions. So I'm going to ask those questions right now on behalf of our audience. So Mr. Brown, you're still on the line, right? Yeah. This question goes to you, Mr. Brown.
You've been talking about CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Thank you very much for your explanation. There are a lot of concerns and also challenges and controversy. I have about 3 to 4 questions. First question, in relations with the CBAM, developing countries like India or China, they might have the common, they are opposing that because of the common responsibilities. But also I heard that about 6 months ago, the United States are also expressing very cautious position. So do you have any idea about the US position regarding EU's CBAM? That's first question. Second, I think you have already mentioned during your presentation, you talked about IAEM, individual adjustment mechanism. Individual adjustment mechanism. Can you elaborate, because people are curious about this individual adjustment mechanism? I would appreciate if you could elaborate. Third question, CBAM itself. How do you see the future, your personal view? What's your take on the future of the CBAM? So 3 questions.
Thank you very much. So take those in order. The US position is an interesting one. And there were statements, I think, that President Biden made before he was president that were favorable towards the idea of carbon border adjustment. Obviously, you're starting from a position in the US where they don't have a national carbon pricing regime to begin with. If they did, maybe it would be a more obvious thing to sell within America, because obviously it would serve to some extent protect their industries in a way which would be particularly acceptable. There has been some people speculate whether, since the US has made, as you say, some cautious noises about the EU CBAM, whether in fact the EU may wait and not produce its proposal in July, as it said, but maybe wait until after, see what happens with COP26 in November. That's one possibility. And as you say, there are big issues with other important international players like India and China. China perhaps in a stronger position than India, in the sense that it is its own carbon pricing system. The Chinese ETS is now going national and seems to be speeding up quite quickly in terms of the extent to which it applies to the Chinese industry. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and we'll see. But as I say, I think the EU is keen to do something. In terms of the individual adjustment mechanism, yes, that's obviously really important. I mean, I guess part of the theory of a CBAM is that, as I said, it's encouraging other countries to develop their own carbon pricing mechanisms, because they're going to face, their exports will face the carbon pricing anyway. But in the meantime, if you were one of the excellent companies that we've been hearing about, sitting in a generally high emitting jurisdiction, but using renewable energy and so on, you'll want to get credit for that. And personally, I think there should be a mechanism for that. It should be possible to do that, but you need a system for tracing those supply chains and verifying the greenness of the energy supply to the products concerned. I think that's very possible with the technology we have, and possibly even using things like distributed ledger technology to certify that. But I don't know whether those proposals will be there in the proposal that comes from the Commission at the start. In terms of the future, I think this is an idea which is gaining a lot of traction. I just read in my paper this morning in the UK, although there is no official government policy. The UK has only just managed to work out what its carbon pricing is going to be after falling out of the EU, and it has said essentially that it will have a version of the, but we're happy to have a version of the EU ETS called the UK ETS, and people, quite influential people within the Conservative Party, are starting to call for that to go along with having a CBAM, and you can see that. I mean, it would be. It makes sense because still the UK and EU economies are sufficiently close together for them to have for the UK to have a similar system to whatever the EU does. But I suspect it will wait and see before bringing forward any proposals of its own. So, yeah, I think it's obviously it's complicated administratively, it's complicated politically, but I think these things are going to come.
대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for your comments. I think everyone will find your comments just now very helpful in understanding the mechanism. Personally, I found it very insightful. And I do understand that you're currently in London. It's probably very early in the day. Thank you so much for joining us at such an early hour. And next up, out of the questions that we have collected, there were several directed to the Ministry of Environment. So I'm going to ask this to Mr. Oh. So 3 questions. The first one is, the president has said that he will revise up the NDCs by the end of this year. Are there any outlooks, or could you expand on that, how exactly that's going to be implemented? And second question, the green taxonomy that you mentioned. The EU already has it in place, and I believe that the Ministry of Environment will announce the draft of that in Korea in June. Are there anything that we should be mindful of regarding that taxonomy? And the third question regarding automobiles. The level of emissions for vehicles are being tightened constantly. And we don't have that much visibility on future regulations. So are you aware of any timeline regarding the regulation related to EVs? So could you answer all 3 of those questions, please? First of all, regarding the NDC and the upward adjustment of the NDC, as I mentioned in my presentation, that would take place in the second half of this year. So probably in November, we will be announcing the final target. Before that, we're going to have a phase to collect opinions. So we will be open for opinions in August and September. And I mentioned that we plan to install a carbon neutrality committee. If that committee is established, that's going to deliberate on the detailed targets before we announce the final version. So that's just about everything that I have to say regarding NDCs. Second question, the taxonomy and anything to watch out for. The underlying goal of K taxonomy is to be referred to when issuing green bonds or when making investments into companies. So what qualifies as green? What falls under green, quote unquote? So our goal is to create a criteria or such based on K taxonomy. When you're trying to create a product A, the amount of emissions required to produce that product, if it's around 10 kilograms, for instance, that's going to be a low carbon product. So the overall idea is to establish a framework to be used as reference when issuing green bonds, so that the companies that are doing a good job can have an advantage, and that there will be greater incentives for companies to reduce their emissions, and that they would be more eligible to attract investments. And it will also be a criteria to select blue chip companies or promising companies from the perspective of ESG. So at the end of the day, the green taxonomy, there is an aspect, a business aspect to that. And another aspect is social, like building infrastructure and buildings. So when you're trying to roll out a new project, you can base the project on the green taxonomy. If it's regarded as a green project, you will have more opportunities to attract investments. So I think the green taxonomy will not only apply to individual companies, but also to investors and also to developers that will be implementing projects, because you will have to meet the green taxonomy in order to be certified as a green project. But it's not a obligation, it's an option. It's optional, but considering the social sentiment, if you fall under a qualified company regarding the K taxonomy, you'll be regarded as a much more eligible candidate. And the third question, the CO2 regulation for commercial cars, it has been tightened from 20% to 25% to 30% reduction. These are EU standards, and I think the question is more about when are the detailed criteria for road emissions for Korean cars are going to come out, and so forth. The CO2 regulations for commercial vehicles in Korea are still very much autonomous. It's being recommended. However, in the near future, it's going to be turned to a mandatory regulation. The current fleets on the road are, I don't remember the figures exactly, but I think they're going to be encouraged to reduce emissions by 2% and 3.5% by next year, probably, but I'm not really sure. And you mentioned the emissions on the road, but the regulations are not based on the emissions on the road, because we mostly run it on computer simulation. So fine dust and N2Os and other particles have a set standard which you are not allowed to exceed. In that case, we measure the emissions on the road, but just to we do not have on-road tests when we set the regulations for CO2. So I think that would be the end for my comments.
Thank you. I believe that all of you, especially the people who pose questions, are very clear. Next, as I mentioned, would like to pose a question to Mr. Yoon, who presented the case of BASF Korea. You mentioned that BASF is planning to reduce your GHG emission by 50%, about 50 million from the supplier. You also mentioned that half of the carbon are being emitted from the supplier side. Do you have a specific idea? How are you going to do that? About 52 million tons of the CO2 is being emitted by our suppliers, and they produce raw materials and then deliver all the raw material to us, and we track them down. there are two cases. The first one is from the point of purchasing the raw material. For example, we check the carbon footprint, and we can find a way to do that. So supplier need to make effort to reduce CO2 emission, and only when they make effort, they will be able to provide the raw material. Second is optimizing the supply, like racking that I have mentioned, the process that we do. We produce various ways like methane and like using cracker that emits CO2. But if we use different raw materials, if we get from the dry formation, then the methane will turn into CO2. And CO2 will become the raw materials, which means that it will record minus emission. So as I mentioned, one way is from the supply side, we can reduce the carbon print. We will operate a certification system so that when supply provide us raw material, they need to reduce GHG emissions. Second, we will develop a new process technology that will require less pollution, so which means that emitting less CO2 emissions. So overall, even before we start our productions, we will find a way to reduce CO2 emission.
네, 설명 감사합니다.
Thank you for your explanation. I think that's what most companies are most interested in, because when you're trying to implement ESG management, you have to, well, you cannot help but be influenced by not only your business activities, but also the activities of your business partners and the stakeholders across the value chain. So I think the companies should find ways to jointly reduce CO2 emissions with all of their vendors and partner companies. So thank you for your comment. The next question goes to Mr. Hall from POSCO. Like I hinted earlier, I want to ask a question about avoided emissions. I think the audience would be curious about that concept, because we're still curious as to whether that really counts as an emissions reduction. So could you elaborate on that? Yes, well, I'm sure that it's quite an unfamiliar concept. It could seem very tricky. I suggest that you refer to the Greenhouse Protocol by WRI and WPCSB. It stipulates scope 1, 2, and 3 for CO2, and it also defines avoided emissions. It also talks about what it is and why it's important. Just to explain briefly, it's a matter of course that business sites should make efforts to reduce emissions, but there's more that we can do, because greenhouse gas emissions reduction cannot be achieved by the efforts of one single company alone. Every citizen in the world have to join hands in order to achieve that. But we have to admit the fact that there are differences across different stakeholders, just like the CBDR highlighted. Well, the avoided expenses is very important, because when the companies are trying to go green, they end up spending more expenses and facing higher costs, which could be trouble over the short term. So the company has to think about the impact, the social impact, and the contribution that their products can make if they create a low carbon product. So if the consumers believe that this product will usher in a more sustainable planet, they will opt to use those products, right? So all the guidances by CBDR and other institutions say that, of course, you have to reduce emissions at your business sites, but you have to take one step further and try to contribute to the reduction of global emissions at the global level by creating better products. And whether or not this company is capable of creating a low carbon product will determine the competitiveness of the companies in the future. And I hope that you are not mistaken by you have to be aware of the fact that you cannot receive allowances by making reductions in avoided expenses. This is just a commitment on the company's part to reduce not only scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions, but also avoided emissions. So we just want you to understand that this is a third-party verification that gives companies the certification that they have also contributed to the reductions in a different way. Well, thank you so much for that explanation. Now that I've heard your comment, I have realized that, well, I just talked about the supply chain earlier, and more companies are required to monitor the emissions by their vendors as well. And they're also required to create better products to reduce indirect emissions. So there are various ways to make efforts to cap carbon. We are 7 minutes behind our schedule. We'll try to wrap up within 3 minutes. So last but not least, we have a question for Mr. Yoon. Since you're an expert in ESG, could you talk about the relationship between ESG and carbon neutrality? Right, that was a very tricky question, but he gave me 3 minutes to answer that, so I'll try to keep my answer brief. In my personal opinion, ESG management and the ESG dialogue will have continuous momentum because it's related to carbon neutrality. ESG G stands for governance, and this will vary depending on the local regulations. And especially climate change and carbon neutrality is a universal topic that each and every country has to fight together. So in that regard, ESG management is going to be a global initiative. It's not a passing trend. It's going to stay here permanently. So we ask ourselves, is ESG going to end as a fad, just like CSR or other corporate ethics? But the answer is no. It represents a new paradigm, so I hope that answered your question. I'm going to wrap up at this point.
Thank you. Very short, but precise and accurate, with full of core message. Thank you for your answer. It's a time to wrap up today's meeting. We could accept a lot of questions, but I would like to ask for your understanding that we cannot do so. Once again, under the theme of the climate neutrality, we've been discussing about the policies of the EU and Korea and also the company cases. Once again, thank you very much to 5 presenters and also EUCCK and also European Union delegation to Republic of Korea. Thank you for co-hosting today's webinar. Today's EU-Korea business webinar is a great opportunity for both countries to work together to achieve 2050 climate neutrality. A lot of participants are joining us virtually, and I'm sure that you were able to learn a lot about what is happening. Thank you. That concludes today's 2050 climate neutrality EU-Korea business webinar. Thank you for joining us.